Hey, this is Joe, and today we're going to go over some examples for factor by grouping when working with a quadratic expression. This is what a standard quadratic expression looks like, and our goal is to get this expression to its factored form. So let's review the steps for factor by grouping. The first thing you do is multiply the a and c term together, and then find factors of a and c that add up to b. We then split bx into parts and group the terms together. Within each grouping, we then find the GCF and factor it out of each group. Finally, we factor the common binomial found in each group at the end. Now let's move on to our examples. And as you recall, we like to show three different types of examples: an easy example, a medium example, and a hard example. So let's begin with the easy example. An easy example would be when a and c are positive and prime. Consider the quadratic expression 5x squared plus 16x plus 3. Here, both a and c are positive and prime. So let's begin the grouping process. First, we multiply a and c together, and we see that we get 15. We also note that b is equal to 16. Now we want to find our factors of 15. Well, 1 times 15 is a factor pair, and also I get 3 times 5. I really don't have any other options now. This is the case because a and c are both prime. Looking at the sum of the factors, we see that 1 plus 15 equals 16, which is our value of b. And so we found our factors that we want to use to split bx. This allows us to rewrite 16x as 15x plus 1x. Now we group 5x squared and 15x, and we call that group 1. And we're going to group 1x and 3 and call that group 2. We then find the GCF of each group. And so for group 1, the GCF is 5x. And for group 2, you say, well, I can't really factor anything out, right? I got a 1, I got a 3, I got an x, but I don't got anything that's in both terms. When this happens, you want to make sure you let your GCF be 1. And I'll show you why we do that shortly. Next, we factor the GCFs out of each group. Now, group 1 becomes 5x times the quantity x plus 3. And group 2 becomes 1 times the quantity x plus 3. Within each grouping, we notice that x plus 3 is a common binomial. And so we want to bring x plus 3 out to the front. When we do that, you see we're left over with 5x plus 1. And so the factored form of our quadratic expression is x plus 3 times 5x plus 1. Notice if we didn't write down 1 as the GCF of group 2 earlier, we probably wouldn't have a 1 in here, and we actually wouldn't have the correct factored form. So that's why it's important that when you have a group that has no common factor greater than 1, you at least write its greatest common factor as 1. And so we solve the easy problem. Remember, when a and c are prime, we do not have to consider too many factor pairs to determine how to split up bx. So let's move on to the medium problem. A medium level difficulty problem would be when a or c are negative and they're not prime. So let's consider the problem 6x squared plus 1x minus 77. Here, when we multiply a and c together, we get negative 462. And so we now have to find factors of negative 462 that add up to be positive 1 because b is equal to 1 here. As always, one factor pair is 1 times negative 462. And we also get negative 1 times positive 462. Now, since b is positive, we know that the larger factor has to be positive, and so we can cross out positive 1 and negative 462. And so as we find more factor pairs, the smaller number is going to be negative, and the larger number is going to be positive. Now, I completed this list for us just to save us some time. And if we sum up our factor pairs, we see that negative 21 plus 22 is going to be equal 1, which was our b value. And so negative 21 and positive 22 must be the factors that we'll use to split up bx. In the next step, we're going to replace 1x with 22x minus 21x. We then group 22x with 6x squared, and then we group negative 21x with negative 77. We find that the GCF of the first group is 2x, and the GCF of the second group is negative 7. And so we must factor those out of each group. After factoring our GCFs out, we see that 3x plus 11 is the common binomial within each group, and so we're going to bring 3x plus 11 out to the front. This gives us our factored form of the quadratic expression. We now know that 6x squared plus 1x minus 77 is equal to 3x plus 11 times the quantity 2x minus 7. With everything in front of us, to get from the first step to the second step, we split the bx term into factors of a times c that summed up to b. We then factored out the GCF of both groups in order to get from the second to the third step. And finally, at the end, we factor out the common binomial to get to our final factored form. Now, I'm going to leave this up for a few seconds so you can pause the video and take some notes. Now let's move on to our hard problem. The only thing we're going to add to the medium level problem is that all our values a, b, and c will share a common factor here. Let's consider the problem 150x squared minus 80x minus 160. Notice that our a, b, and c terms all have a factor of 10. In other words, we can rewrite them as if they were all 10 times a different number for each value. What this means is that before we begin the grouping process, we should actually factor out the common factor. Now, I haven't had this in the previous problems, but it's important that you look for this every time that you're working with any of these problems. Because really you can have a common factor for a, b, and c at any level of difficulty. So in this problem, all we do is bring 10 out to the front, and then we proceed with the expression that's left on the inside the same way we did the medium problem. Here we see that a and c, when they're multiplied together, give us negative 240. And so then we have to look for the factors of negative 240 that are going to add up to negative 8. Since b is negative here, we're going to make sure that our factor list only contains factor pairs where the larger number is negative. So here is our factor list on the left, and on the right we have the sums of all the factors. And you'll notice that when we add positive 12 and negative 20 together, we're going to get negative 8. And we just proceed with the problem as if we were doing the medium problem, where we now replace negative 8x with negative 20x plus 12x. We determine the GCF of each grouping. We then factor the GCF out of each grouping. We then factor out the common binomial, and we get our final answer. It's important that you keep the 10 out front and that you keep the 10 in that final answer. As you can see, we get 150x squared minus 80x minus 160 equals 10 times the quantity 3x minus 4 times the quantity 5x plus 4. If you'd like to work on problems with similar difficulty to the 3 that I've shown in this video, please look at the exercises I included in the description below. And of course, thank you for spending some time with me.